All right, thank you for joining us for our July call. We are the Florida Invasive Species Council's Partnership Assistance and Communications Committee, or FISC-PAC. We coordinate with the various CISMAs across the state to look to address invasive species issues across all lines. Would ask if you go ahead and mute yourselves throughout the presentation. If you have any questions as we go through, please put them in the chat, and we will have time at the end of our feature presentation to address those. So for today, we'll go through this brief welcome, and then we'll hand it over to Paul Evans, who will be telling us about some research that he's been doing looking at invasive species habitat modeling. And then we'll get an update from the Six Rivers CISMA and about some of the statewide events that are going on. So Paul Evans is the research coordinator for UF's Invasion Science Research Institute, or ISRI, and he collaborates with affiliated partners of ISRI and both internal and external boards to develop and produce necessary and exciting research. He focuses on community-based education and reporting initiatives, community ecology, and species distribution for terrestrial invasive species. He received his master's in ecology and conservation from the University of Aberdeen and his bachelor's from the University of South Florida. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you now, Paul.
Okay, good afternoon. I have accidentally bamboozled all of you into this was originally supposed to be on just avians. But there's a lesson to this. When your laptop that has everything on it dies and you're not able to access any of your data, please put it on a second form. I will be able to get it back by Friday, so that's good, but you know, there's a lesson in there. So shifting slightly into kind of part 1/part 2 of what led into more of the habitat modeling, which starts with Leftovers Initiative, which is identifying gaps in invasion ecology. So a little overview, I'll introduce what that is. We'll go into knowledge gaps that have been identified, ways that ISRI we are beginning to try to close some of these gaps, and kind of talk about some of these discussions and takeaways at the end. A lot of these species are ones that maybe we would more specifically call non-native, kind of in that gray area where we know they're not from here, but we're not entirely sure all of their impacts quite yet. So Leftovers Initiative has been a 2-year project to fill knowledge gaps for around 54 species. I do believe that is the number we ended up staying at. It's just 54. The initial investigation is on terrestrial vertebrates that are common or have a certain amount of observations on EDMAPS/iNaturalist. So we went with about 100, is where all of these have been at one point in time. And a lot of this has to was kind of born from the increasing spillover species from Florida to potentially new populations. This has potentially happened in several populations throughout the Caribbean and Bermuda, as well as there is definitely a growing concern as things kind of trickle up north throughout parts of the Southeast. So some of these species are things that we really commonly can see and find. A lot of them tend to be very urbanized and adaptable species, especially in some of even our big cities. So things like cattle heron, Cuban tree frog, greenhouse frog, Egyptian goose, basilisk, and amoeba, which is that green striped but pale-faced lizard that's on here. So a lot of these, you know, even things like the rock pigeon didn't come here. Didn't naturally evolve and adapt to live here and just kind of have been introduced over time. So a lot of this with many of these species, because so many of them tend to be things that potentially we more commonly see, we have a lot of things that we tend to think we know about a lot of these animals. So taxonomy, kind of broadly with any species, we tend to know a good amount about how animals are connected and where they come from. distribution, especially with the rapidly increasing use of citizen science data and more community-based reporting. Distribution definitely has began to solidify and become better. And then impacts, typically in what they eat or what is eaten, tend to be how we begin to look at more of these animals. But there's a lot of other problems, a lot of other sides to invasion science. It's a very multi-interdisciplinary field. So this is where we kind of get to a big little problem where size can matter. We can have a lot of these smaller animals that, unfortunately, when we've done this big analysis looking at all the data, a lot of the smaller animals really are being hit and are things that we just unfortunately don't have as much information on, as well as when we get to some of these larger animals, things like nutria, Burmese python, or nilgai. These are animals you would potentially, because they're so much larger, you would kind of hope, if not just here, at least in their native range, we'd be able to have a lot more from them, where things such as a greenhouse frog or any of these small tropical parakeets, we so far seemingly would suspect not to have a whole lot. Now, this is where scale is important because obviously cane toads, pretty well reported, pretty well studied, as they've had a very large global invasion. But when we look at some of these smaller frogs that also have had a very large invasion, there's definitely a size disproportion in some of the attention, at the very least, that's been gathered, and potentially funding for looking at some of these animals. And a lot of this does have to deal with, the local ecology as well as taxonomic groups. You notice when you see a frog about this big. You may not notice when you see one about that small, and that's okay, because in some places you may not have big frogs or larger toads at all. So it's one of those things that's a pretty natural recollection. Now, the other thing that's very important is perception. So when we're dealing with citizens, when we're dealing with kind of resource management, perception from a society or cultural standpoint is very important. You have some native fauna like animals. So some of these non-natives that look similar. This happens a lot with some of the waterboard birds. So scarlet ibis, cattle heron, a lot of them we kind of just recognize as some other beautiful wetland bird that we have here in Florida. So your perception may not actually be, or the public perception may not actually be, that that's a bad animal because it's not different enough for us to start to put some of that recollection for. The other side of this is, of course, charismatic. There are very large populations of feral and non-native horse, donkey, all out west that have caused really impactful environmental damages, but they're protected and cared for because there's such a strong public response. Similar things have happened here with Rhesus macaque in Silver Springs. And then when we have non-charismatic animals with the giant apple snail, I'm not saying giant apple snails can't be charismatic, but they'd probably have a harder time convincing people to care more deeply for them from a protection standpoint as a non-native animal. But this is why sometimes these non-charismatic animals are the ones that potentially in the media we tend to see potentially demonized a bit more. So when we're looking at some of this media, you kind of start to see how different subjects in invasion science can be referred to. We have plants that are pretty like self-help. Is this in your backyard? When we start talking to animals, we tend to start to get this conversation of humanity, appropriateness, how to really handle parts of it. And then as you kind of move through, you start to see, okay, well, invasive rodents. Research may help protect Hawaiian forest. So we may be like, oh, well, this is a positive thing. No, if you actually read it, it has nothing to do with it, but it's a good headline because it makes you think about how we potentially, there could be positives. And then, of course, as I'm sure a lot of us here are more used to, is the monster. Finding the biggest animal, the heaviest animal, and how a lot of this stuff tends to be what is the vernacular that does best, because the perception of some of these larger animals or any of these invasive species, if you can make it negative and impactful, that tends to be what the public likes to react with most. But that doesn't mean from a scientific standpoint, that's actually the correct message, Especially for some of these animals where we do know we have knowledge gaps. We do know that there's a lot of things we don't know yet. So with all 54 of these species, we've gone through the peaks and valleys of looking at everything that has been published and written on them in the English language. As far back as we go to the end of, to the end of 2023. The purpose of this is hoping to look in a couple of years to see how some of this is changing, and seeing what trends kind of start to pop up in research and ecology of these species. We used both journal keywords, and then we had AI read every single paper to then generate additional keywords based on what was actually presented. So in there, we kind of start to see some more probably truth to what they were writing. Sometimes keywords can be a little bit for the marketplace. Now, all these keywords were sorted into 6 categories. These 6 categories are the pretty normal categories that we use for species profiling. So biology, ecology, distribution, management, and then cultural/social use. And taxonomy. So within those, kind of wanted to look at some of those assumptions we talked about and kind of see how a lot of this research works. Now, here we can already begin to see that 2 of these guys, super popular. So anyone want to take a whack at what is our yellow group of animals?
Reptiles?
So that is Herpetofauna. So that is where we have our reptiles. Then we have green, where will be our avians, and purple is our mammals. So this is kind of our grouping. When we do the deeper analysis, we did end up splitting amphibians and reptiles to more look inside those actual taxonomical groups. But from a perception standpoint, this still works for us to kind of see. But as you can see, clawed frog, rhesus monkey, we know a lot about. We know a whole lot of stuff on them. However, it's a little deceiving because what we actually know a lot about them is medical testing for humans. Now, if you know the story of rhesus macaques here in Florida, you probably could have started to put some of that together. But for things like clawed frogs, it's actually medical testing for pregnancy tests. There's stuff in their genetic material that lead into that. I don't know more than that. But because of this, we did remove these as they were such strong outliers when wanting to actually look at everything. But when we actually look at both these animals, all of it is essentially in biology, and everything else is very similar to a lot of the other trends that we found. So let's look at size. If we're going from smallest to largest, what are some of these sizes going to be? Well, as we can see, for the most part, size doesn't quite seem to have a big trend. For the most part, hasn't been super evolved. This is getting slightly ahead, but in the analysis that's dead on my other laptop, within taxonomies, size did have an impact in only 2 categories, which was ecology and culture. So potentially there are more to be done in studying visually the importance of seeing and recognizing species for something to be developed into the fabric of culture in a society. But as you can see, for the most part, across the board, when we just take everything at face value, not a whole lot of any trends. When we look at earliest to most recent, in terms of when things established, you see a little bit more of things that were established very early on, specifically more in mammals. A lot of that has to do with colonialism, but as we can also see there, with cats being so low, a lot of that does have to do again with culture. The majority of these species have very large categorical gaps. So although we may have 8 to 10,000 papers for some of these animals, when you actually get into weeds, a lot of it does not tell us nearly as much as you would want it to. So this kind of goes into, what do we actually know? When we are looking at a lot of the subject matter, what can we actually take away? So I'm using amoeba here as an example. This is how it's all split up. And for the most part, we have all 6 categories there. This is one of the few small lizards that actually has legitimate research and culture and what that means for in its home range as species, which is kind of a cool just a cool fun fact. But when we start to look at some of these more details and we get to things like distribution range, well, a lot of the times it is just country of origin or its ecoregion, and it doesn't really help when we are dealing with, we'll say, one specific county, or we're dealing with the first population that's potentially starting to pop up in South Georgia. This doesn't really give us a whole lot of information because we already know it's from Argentina or Ecuador. And the fact that this is all that exists for parts of it can be very, very, very upsetting. So it's one of those things of wanting to kind of starting to push that more for the sake of understanding what is out there. What we don't know is actually, in my opinion, a little bit more interesting because, as you can see, no cultural or social data on most species that we talked about. This includes even in their native range. If there were cultural stuff, it either got into something with zoo education, or it is usually culturally linked information from their native range. Very little for a lot of these smaller species. This is the brown anole, despite the fact that, we have potentially hundreds of years of them being potentially in Florida. Sorry, I just had a crow like pop up into my window. So what was missing? This is my favorite fun fact because it seems a little ludicrous for what we know, but Florida was missing for most of these species. And again, some of these were only dealing with a couple years of data of them being in the States, so we wouldn't expect them. But there are, out of the 54, most of them have records going back into at least the 90s. And that's a very long time for us to have no recognition in the literature of Florida. And a lot of this, the reason it really matters is, again, is that spillover, that Florida is kind of viewed as Jurassic Park, but the way a lot of things are going, whether it's climate change, whether it's just natural distribution, we won't stay the only Jurassic Park forever at the rate a lot of the stuff is going. So despite thousands of observations, these species, only 10 of the 54 actually have Florida mentioned. Most of them would be species we classify as our flagships. So things like Burmese python, tegu, Nile monitor, Cuban tree frog, feral hog, sacred ibis, and I can't remember the other ones, but it's the ones that you kind of tend to think about a lot more. They're cane toad. It's things that are very, very much already in the conversation, where some of these other ones, we tend to have problems. But even with those 10, we have pretty severe landscape ecology or distribution for all of the species, even when we include their native range. Most of the time, the only stuff that was of note for especially these understudied animals was basically from 1800s, 1700s. So not bad, but definitely the environment and ecosystems have changed quite a bit since then. So what we've learned in going through and identifying leftover species. Now, there are many species that technically qualified as a leftover species. What this means is it did not either meet the mean across all 54 species for any categories, or at least 4 of the 6 categories, or it didn't meet it within its own taxonomic group. And within this, we start to see some trends where almost every single parrot or parakeet, so a lot of these tropical avians, we just really don't have almost any data on outside of taxonomy and a few native range studies. But for some of these animals, we're talking about 8 papers in total. So very, very few. Things like the white-winged parakeet. Now, a lot of these have pretty small populations that we know of here in Florida, but there are potentially 9 that have established at least one point in part of Florida. We're dealing with smaller lizards, so things like Ameiva, despite having a pretty robust population in parts of South Florida. Not really a whole lot of data outside of a few impacts. So again, some of those predation events, but even when we use their home range, very little has actually been talked about in terms of their ecology. Things like nilgai is the largest one here. Granted, we don't have necessarily a huge population here in Florida, but it is having a pretty large population in Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi. So it being a large non-native game antelope that was introduced, at least in Texas, I know for sure was for the purpose of game. Being a game animal, it's a very large animal, and it's the 3rd largest antelope in the world, and seemingly only have I think it was 34 papers. So it's one of these things where, as you're kind of starting to see, a lot of the trends and assumptions we kind of would hope would be true end up not being very accurate. Things like spurred tortoise or the swamp hen, the non-native swamp hen, not our native one, really do not have a whole lot of ecology, management, or any cultural data from, and a lot of that's difficult because these are some of the species that are beginning to be reported vastly more than they were in recent years. And those impacts are still left to be discovered. When we look at the actual, we'll say taxonomies, so looking at some of these larger groups, the main 3 that really start to pop up is tropical avian. So again, all those various birds are small lizards, including geckos, and then non-native game. So animals that were maybe not the most widespread in Florida, but are definitely potentially more of a southeast problem, tend to be some of that game animals. But even in their home range, you know, some of these things are big, beautiful animals like Gemsbach that you've grown up seeing in zoos or beautiful photos of in National Geographic. But actually, in the true amount of knowledge, you know, we know more about feral cats as a population than we do some of these large antelopes. And it really is quite interesting. Of course, overall, herpetofauna was very low. Both amphibians and reptiles, if we remove the big flagship reptiles, it actually is lower than amphibians in terms of lack of data. And of the 54 species, 36 actually tested to be significantly understudied and would be identified as leftovers when we look at the entire. So that's kind of a problem when, you know, that's potentially thousands of individual animals, 36 populations statewide or regionally that we seemingly probably do not have enough information on to properly study, manage, or monitor at this time. So to make things a little positive, how can we close this gap? Once we identify some of these problems, what are ways that actually we can begin figuring out ways to close this? So one of the big things with Florida is urbanization. Since the year 2000, we are the third or fourth fastest growing state. Since COVID, we're number one. So it is constantly moving, it is constantly growing. And as this shift begins to happen, a lot of the times these urban, suburban areas is where that first introduction tends to happen. So once they're in those habitats, what happens when they move to our more natural and we'll say less impacted habitats? What is kind of the distribution that's happening between these two? So to go through this, data was pulled from I've Got One and iNaturalist, modeled using countrywide land cover data to begin looking at how we can potentially project stuff across the Southeast. Frequency of occurrence was conducted for various subclasses and seasons, as well as a few different types of indexes to kind of begin informing a hotspot analysis. Yeah, I only have the herpetofauna hotspot analysis. Well, you'll see. I have parts of both. Whenever the laptop returns, I'm happy to send Deb the other PowerPoint so people can see some of the other information. So getting into some of this, when we looked at house geckos, so if you don't know, we have 3 house geckos that have populations here. They had the lowest habitat diversity. Not too crazy, because I'm sure most of you, when you see this, it is probably not even on a tree. It's on the side of your house. It's on the side of a building. It's a parking garage, which kind of makes an interesting point for how low of a how low of vegetation do these species need to actually succeed. Things like agama and basilisk had the greatest habitat diversity. Not too shocking. They're both more predatory, about 1 foot to 1.5 feet in length. So still a small lizard in the grand scheme of the 3 to 4 foot behemoths that we have introduced here, but still not a small animal necessarily, and definitely is species that tend to move or distribute quite a bit. Now, 8 of the 9 test herpetofauna species had a greater habitat diversity in the dry season. Not super shocking, as most of these animals don't necessarily have semi-aquatic as a thing they're known for, but definitely more water tolerant. 5 of the 9 species have greater habitat evenness. So it means in these regions that they were in, for the most part, it was pretty much the same. Now, a lot of this is slightly biased in terms of we have 5 different types of developed regions. And this goes from deep inner city all the way to, more grassy, sparse, rural suburbia. So in those, you have a variety of different microhabitats, but for the most part, you're dealing with an anthropogenic dominated area that does throw the evenness a little bit in that dry season. And at least 20 observations did take place in every single habitat type. So this is 24 habitat types. So clearly, for the most part, 1 or 2 of these species is able to succeed to a certain degree in almost every habitat that's here. Now, when we want to start looking at some of our preference, you don't necessarily need to know how this table fully works. What you more want to take away is where we kind of start to see some of these archetypes of animals start to run together. So things like agama, amoeba, and basilisk all are pretty similar. Same with nidernal, tend to be pretty similar. And it's, again, somewhere in a 9-inch to about 1.5 foot lizard that more than likely is predatory or at the very least, extremely generalist. So it's going to be moving a lot. There's a lot more metabolic action from them, where some of these smaller animals, like our geckos, greenhouse frogs, for the most part, they're going to have a much smaller habitat similarity to some of those larger animals. The only one that kind of, interestingly enough, tested against that is actually Amoeba and Mediterranean gecko. And this is, again, really, really big developed spaces. So developed 2 and 3. So kind of leaving the edge of the city and moving into our more traditional suburbs. That's this area. And tested very well. So this potentially means the bulk of amoeba populations have not actually left, or at least based on what we know, have not really left true suburban reaches yet. Getting to more of kind of some of these other results, looking at similarity, about 83% had similarity between seasons. So the shift that is naturally occurring, although it may be significant from season to season or habitat to habitat, primarily it seems to be impacting most of the introduced species very similarly. Agama had the most seasonal habitat variation. It's a sub-Saharan lizard, so makes the most sense, as a lot of these other animals tend to be, I would say, more on the tropical side for the most part, or are those very old, like 100 to 150-year-old introduction cases, things like rock pigeon, things like some of these animals that are just not going to have the same variation that potentially they may have had their first, 10 to 20 years of being introduced. Developed spaces, as I said, least amount of variation. For the most part, this is a very, very consistent region for a lot of these animals to exist. And then where we saw the most, definitely here in Florida, it makes a lot of sense that pastures, shrubland, and grasslands, places that are going to very easily flood based on our wet season, are going to be the ones most impacted. And then a lot of animals that we would classify more as arboreal had the most similar variation. So that's kind of changing the least, which, geckos, some of these animals, primarily, they may never leave that chunk of cement where they spent most of their life. So what is the point of all of this? Well, for the most part, there's a lot that we don't know about these animals, but some of these first couple of trends can really be helpful in identifying where potentially more research needs to be, as well as beginning to inform management or monitoring, kind of in pushing it towards the right direction. So getting into these hotspot analysis, a lot of this started initially because I'm on the Partners for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Disease Task Team. And one of the biggest worries is Bisol, which is a bacteria disease that is very, very bad for a lot of amphibians specifically that are not native from Oceania / Southeast Asia. So there was a horrible outbreak in Europe to a lot of their salamander populations. And the Southeast is one of the highest tested places to be impacted from. And 2 of our species of non-native frogs, being greenhouse frog and Cuban tree frog, have the potential to be asymptomatic. And this is a problem, as a lot of the things we have moving from North Florida into the rest of the Southeast are not typically ones that are talked about, let alone to some of these more sparse rural communities throughout the Southeast, where a lot of endemic frogs and salamanders live. I don't know if anyone knows this here on the chat, but Alabama, as well as the foothills of North Carolina, have some of the greatest herpetofauna, not just in America, but the world. You have some of the highest diversity numbers. So with a lot of those areas, a lot of this is very important to make sure that if you guys see sick herpetofauna to report it to HDAS, because it's very helpful. But this is where kind of a lot of these maps began to be built from. I was trying to understand where some of these animals are potentially moving through or doing well from wet to dry season to begin looking at areas of concern as things move northward. So the agama lizard, for the most part, as we talked about, sub-Saharan lizard does not really love wet season and rain. Clearly, it's not dying from it, but it definitely seems to have an influence on its ability to distribute and select habitats. But as you see, when we move into dry season, it starts to open up a lot. If you've ever driven the turnpike and you hop and you stop at each bathroom, you basically can see agamas at every single gas station moving up the turnpike. I have no other data besides observational data to support this, but it does seem that they are potentially using parts of our human infrastructure, highway infrastructure, to disperse rather than potentially some of these native systems. Specifically, as you can kind of see here in dry season, middle of the state doing great. Some of these other places definitely have lower predictability. Things like greenhouse frog, as you can see, for the most part, a lot of them tend to, in wet season, have high use in our swamp areas, but nowhere really are we getting low use besides some of these dead areas in the south, that for the most part, it's just unfortunately that there is absolutely no data, and it happened to be a different type of swamp than the rest of the swamps. So it doesn't quite probably speak true to that we don't have greenhouse frogs down there as much as potentially it is a less viable type of wetland compared to some of the other ones. But as we start to move up into the panhandle, we can see where they're having really no problems. Not the highest use, but still in a good survivable use area. And then even in dry season, we're still doing pretty decent outside of the very northern tip. Now, this doesn't mean that for Georgia, Alabama, and especially Louisiana, that this would still be the same, because this type of projection only exists within here. When we do it for the whole Southeast, it does push our low use area about into Tennessee and North Carolina. So you have, some more variety, but definitely still have a potential. And some observations I do believe have started in South Georgia for greenhouse frogs. Basilisk lizard, kind of similar to agama, but for the most part, so you can see kind of the least variety between the two makes sense. It's a tropical lizard from various rainforests throughout Central America and parts of South America. So, the very tip of Florida, the bottom, is really, really its ideal habitat based on what we have here. And as it moves up, it definitely would be more impacted by climate negatively, but the levels of that, we have no idea. There's been no actual climatic studies on the survivability with basilisks yet. And then swamp hen, for the most part, as you can see, does really, really well down in the south. Looks like it would do pretty well in wet season up in the panhandle and just kind of central Florida. Not that it wouldn't necessarily do well, just clear these other regions are going to be better for it during that part of the season. And then as we move into dry, you can kind of start to see the same thing happen where some of the larger urban sprawls or cityscapes up in the north aren't doing the best for them, and it would be mostly the big Everglades, greater Everglades region for where they're going to have the highest. Now, that's great. Maps are lovely. Maps are very, very helpful. But for a lot of those, one of the things that's often asked is like, okay, well, what exactly can we take away from this besides like this region? And so far, it does seem that there is actually a significant change in habitat occurrence seasonally. So what that kind of takes away is that these animals, especially some of the ones that have only been here potentially 5 to 10 years, are very quickly adapting and sinking in to the natural ecosystem and the system that is creating, which, based on the literature, potentially is getting to some of the fastest rates we've ever seen in terms of full sync into the natural system, which is very interesting, but of course also very scary. As we talked about, 36 of these 54, we have very, very little data to understand these animals. So one of the things that we at ISRI are beginning to do is informing extension and outreach. So looking at all these societal trends in terms of invasion science in the media, and beginning to put things together for gaining insight into topics, framing, and word use to potentially down the line make things easier and more appropriate to be shared. So, not everything is biggest monster in the media. It can be more potentially helpful and accurate information that's being shared, as well as identifying what is of interest and what is kind of missing from the media. What are all these understudied species? What are we kind of missing, and what are the ways from what we learned that potentially will shift how we choose to inform the public? And then informing research, bibliometric analysis, as I talked about, we did for all these 54 species. And then our postdoc, Dr. Diane Sturgeon, is currently doing this for all invasive species literature from the past decade to begin to look at what really are we going balls to the wall in and really trying to understand. And then from there, overlap some of those gaps that we're beginning to see and how that potentially lines up with trends we found. And then wildlife value orientations, we're currently doing surveying of many different types of social stuff across the Southeast and Florida, specifically trying to see how potentially if abundance of invasive species has any correlation with how we view positively, negatively, these different animals or these different species across the board. So in conclusion, we don't know a lot. But we do know a lot of what we don't know now, which is nice for moving forward. I like to kind of end it on a positive, that there's a lot of power in knowing what we don't know, because it means a lot of the research and a lot of the modeling you want to begin doing for specifically urban areas. We are currently doing green space analysis, which is technically an urban planning procedure, but we're specifically using it to begin to try to identify, when we have that low variation in all those developed areas, what is the actual percentage of coverage and coverage type of these green spaces that's needed or necessary for successful populations? Because a lot of this could help down the line looking at the diversity in these spaces for potentially informing more urban planning in the future for how to make it less friendly for non-native species. So yeah, that means there's a lot more work to do, a lot to learn. Give a shout out to SLAM, the Snake Lungworm Alliance and Monitoring, because if you thought we didn't know a lot about some of our herpetofauna, wait to hear about the invasive pentostomes, invasive parasites, as well as invasive corals. That's right, guys. We're getting almost everything here so far. Though I will note, invasive coral is technically not here yet. It is in North Cuba. If you're interested in potentially seeing how your recognition or identification skills would be, we have been doing a survey with diving group and naturalists to begin trying to see, as we create more education outreach material for spreading the message on this, what kind of photography and recognition actually would potentially do best. And with that, thank you so much. I will take any questions if we have time.
Oh, so yeah, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions if there are any. Give us group a second. I do have a question. If you want to go back, I think it was slide 26 when you were talking about some of the seasonality, if you could clarify.
Oh gosh.
Make sure I'm wrapping my head around this correctly.
26. You're so astute.
I made a note. You had the number there on there. That was very beneficial, very helpful.
Okay.
All right. So talking about like the
No. All right, we'll go back to it.
so the most and least seasonal variation. So like the least seasonal variation between those different categories, that means that like they all like the same area for about all the same time of the year. Is that what, or is it just like they move similarly between each other and
Yes.
between habitats?
Yeah. So the seasonal variation that was impacting them was very similar. So if they were leaving like developed medium or developed sparse, they were likely moving towards the same type of space, which a lot of the times ended up being either wetland for amphibians and like water birds, or for some of the lizards, it was moving towards for the most part, I'll just be honest, open or dense developed space. A lot of these areas, they weren't going too crazy. Now, I will say some of this could be fixed for accuracy in the future, doing county by county and doing very detailed maps. But obviously, the initial pull for a lot of this is to learn as much about the animals in general to inform the Southeast in general trends. And then next step would probably be good to go do some of that green space analysis in those specific counties to look at that smaller scale. Because I do think for the most part, management and monitoring, the smaller scale you can do, that's where it will be most beneficial.
Totally agree with that. Awesome, thank you. Any
Of
other
course.
questions from the group? All right, well, if you do have questions at any other point, feel free to email Paul. He's always willing to help. And at this point, we'll go ahead and hand it over to Crystal Walsh with Six Rivers CISMA.
Hey Deb, let's see. I don't usually share on Zoom, so I'm gonna see if this works.
Right.
Hopefully. And I'm on a hotspot, so today I lost connectivity like 3 minutes ago, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Well, that's how it works.
Yeah. Okay, that's not it. That's the last slide, and there are no numbers because there are only like 6 slides. So hopefully you won't have to keep track.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
It might just be the internet speeds. Oh, there we go. It's starting to come through now. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing your desktop.
Okay. All right, good. So just wanted to give a quick update on Six Rivers CISMA. We're in the far western panhandle. Usually my co-lead, Rick O'Connor, from the he's the marine science agent for UF-IFAS and located in Escambia County. He usually attends this call. So I often do not attend, and so hopefully I'm on track with the update today. In the upper left-hand corner is our CISMA region, and we do overlap into Alabama. So I've reached out to some of our partners in the last week or so to try to get a few updates from them, and just want to go over a few things about what we have going on. In the last 6 months to a year, we've been very active in burning. We have a very robust PBA, a Prescribed Burn Association, in which our private lands association, our private lands program biologists with FWC are very active. Florida Forest Service always is our partner in that, and we work with private landowners to manage invasives with prescribed fire. So we've been very actively burning, at least by our count on private lands, 575 acres. That does not take into account all that the state forest have been burning. I could not get a total from them, or what GCPEP has accomplished this year. Speaking of GCPEP, you know, they're our go-to in Northwest region for our strike crew. They really lead the way in Kogan grass and tallow treatments. They've got some great funding for private lands assistance for treating, you know, even small landowner properties, an acre or so for tallow, and are very active in Kogan grass treatments in the westernmost counties. Unfortunately, I could not get some numbers from them in the last week or so. We just did create a new survey in the past, and I say in the past, and I'm talking the last 10 years or so. You know, we used to collect from our partners across the region treatment numbers, species numbers, you know, how much chemical and everything that everybody was using. We would collect that and then discuss it, submit it to FISP when FISP was FISP. And we had, you know, a lot of folks retire, move on, and that kind of, we dropped the ball on that. And Ian Stone with UF has been a tremendous help in taking our questions. There's a few sample questions here on the left that we've gotten into a survey in Qualtrics. We've sent that out, and we're hoping to get some really good data from our partners at our annual meeting next month. And hopefully we'll be able to do that again and again. And we tried to make sure that the questions are very similar to what the reporting requirements, you know, they already have reporting requirements. So we try to make those similar so they're not duplicating their efforts. So some of the events and workshops and activities that that we have information about, the Regional Lionfish Workshop, which is usually a huge event, back in February over in Fort Walton Beach. The Hitchhiker Workshop on Cuban tree frogs in Pensacola in April. The Weed Wrangle, Kogan Grass Survey and Beach Vitex removal efforts on Pensacola Beach in the spring. Rick O'Connor also did a presentation to Bayou Chico Association on tilapia. From the FDEP, park rangers led a small workshop with volunteers who turned out for a mechanical removal of invasives along a 1-mile stretch of the Blackwater Heritage Trail. The Blackwater Heritage Trail is in Milton, Florida. It is partially paved, and so they worked along that perimeter for, you know, like 35 to 45 feet on each edge of that roadway back in January. There were some weather hindrances that month, but they did accomplish a good bit. And then the Florida Forest Service here in Santa Rosa County at the Blackwater River State Forest has also been working with private landowners around their borders, helping them to treat invasives, because of course that does benefit the state forest with managing invasives at their borders. From an education and outreach perspective, the Longleaf Alliance, which is part of GCPEP, FWC, the Native Plant Society, and gosh, I can't even remember. There were so many agencies that attended the Walton County Fair last October. We had our CISMA banner, as you can see in this photo, and lots of information, lots of education and outreach going on. And we estimated more than 3,000 folks attended that county fair over a 5-day period. We're hoping to get to that event again this year. Escambia County does I believe it's a weekly newsletter. Some of that content is here on this slide. Also done by Rick. Rick is just a Superman. I don't know how he does what he does, but he really gets the information out there, and there are so many people reached by the information on invasives that gets published through articles and newsletters and outreach programs and blogs that originates through those programs. So they'll continue to work on a video series for NESA this year on invasives, managing beach vitex on Pensacola Beach, and even doing some more surveys for Kogan grass and beach vitex on the barrier islands, Cuban tree frogs, of course, across the Bay Area, lionfish in Pensacola Bay, which are now documented, and tilapia as well in Bayou Chico. Assassin snails are a fairly new effort that we're focusing on and educating on the local pet stores. The Pensacola Lionfish Shootout, Edible Invaders Program, and Halloween, of course, are on the agenda for later this year or next year. And our annual meeting coming up in August, that's going to be the 16th. I think this is probably our claim to fame. If we can't get anything else done in Six Rivers, we certainly have a great annual meeting. We generally have, I think, every partner from every county generally attends this meeting, and we always have it at Blackwater River State Forest at the pavilion. Everybody brings their own lunch. We have some excellent speakers. Deb's coming this year. Deb, I think this is your first year, correct?
Yes.
Yes. And so I know this year we have, and you may have to help me because I'm doing this from memory. We've got, again, a research-packed agenda. We've got Dr. Jeff Hill presenting on, I want to say, migration of tropicals. He's going to be talking about snook and other species and how climate change are affecting the migration of those species. We've got what was the lady from Patty from FDAX that's going to be talking about some regulatory issues with listing of plant species and how that all works. And so she'll be talking, and then we've got Tall Timbers also talking.
All right. I think we may have lost you there, Crystal. Can you hear me? Can anyone else hear me? Or is the problem
Can you hear
on
me?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. And we've got Tall Timbers on the list, and then Deb's going to be, we're going to be doing this game that Deb has in store for us. So we are excited to find out and play the game, which is an educational invasive species management game that all the participants will be involved in. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so that's coming up. We also have CEUs on tap for the meeting, and that's really what we've got going on. So any questions? Anything that I may have left out?
Not that I can think of. And since we've got just 1 minute left to keep ourselves on time, I'm gonna throw a few links in the chat and take over the sharing myself real quickly.
Sounds
Get
good.
things set up. All right. Hold on. That's all right, so I put one chat in and one link in the chat, and I'm going to share this. So as far as like statewide announcements, there's a few job opportunities I want to make everyone aware of. If you give me 1 second, I'm going to throw these other 2 links in the chat so you have access to them. A few of these will end before I get my normal monthly digest out. So those are the main announcements, job opportunities. There are several other really good events coming up over the next month or so. Thankfully, most of them are workshops, so you can be inside in the AC and get a break from your field day work. Lots of good ones, herbicide fundamentals in Heartland CISMA, wild hog management in ONA. And then as far as the rest of our monthly webinar calls, next month, we're going to have several really cool student research presentations, like a lightning round of talks looking at how invasive species threaten some crops, looking at a Florida species that has become invasive elsewhere, and then bringing it back to Florida to look at biocontrol and for one invasive species and an invasive insect. If you have any topics, I'm beginning to work on our 2025 agenda. So please send me any suggestions for topics. This call and all the others are available on our YouTube channel. So I want to thank you all for making time. Have a great month. Try and stay cool, stay hydrated, and stay safe.